Okay, this week we are going to talk about sex and gender, and also a little bit about sexuality. And these are extraordinarily important topics in our culture today. So Chapter 11 discusses gender roles and how they impact the lives of men and women in different societies. One of the most important things to recognize in this section is the difference between the term biological sex and gender. We're going to start with biological sex. So sex, it's a biological or morphological category, and it typically refers to the physical distinction of either male or female. When we discuss morphological, it has to do with form, and in this case, anatomy. It's based on two suites of physical characteristics associated with producing gametes, either ova, eggs, or sperm. Most humans, are born with primarily one suite or the other. But a small percentage are born as intersex individuals with an indeterminate or ambiguous mixture of characteristics. Estimates of the frequency of intersex births depends on exactly what is included in the definition. However, by a strict medical definition, about 1 in 5,000 or less than 1% are born with an ambiguous mixture of characteristics, meaning they cannot be classified as male or female based strictly on physical traits, or their physical traits do not match the sex implied by their sex chromosomes, with XX meaning female and XY meaning male. So when we say their sex chromosomes don't match, it means they have this different suite of sex chromosomes. So XO, XXY, XYY, and so on. And the point of this is that regardless of the exact frequency of intersex births, the common notion of just two unambiguous physical sexes is not really correct. Quite a few intersex people are born every year. So the idea that there are only two physical sexes is a cultural construct. It's not completely arbitrary, because it is based on the idea of the common binary of male and female. That is what is most common. But the idea that there are only two physical sexes does arbitrarily ignore, a lot of uncommon but very real individuals. Now, when we talk about gender, we are talking about a social category. It does refer to the cultural definition of masculinity or femininity, and includes physical distinctions, but also includes behavior, dress, speech, or any other traits that make a person fit a category. Gender refers to two or more social identities or roles partially associated with sex. Genders always include masculine or man and feminine or women. In some societies, one or more additional categories are recognized, and these are referred to by anthropologists as third genders, although there can be many, many more than that. In our society, the number of genders ranges, and the last I checked, Facebook gave you an option, I think it was, of 58 different genders from which to choose. So in our society, we often think of these terms as one and the same because we recognize two sexes, male and female, and two genders, man and woman. That means that in our culture, we do not have a recognized category into which we fit people who prefer to behave in a feminine way even though they are male, or in a masculine way even though they are female. We just don't have a commonly accepted, recognized category for that. However, these categories do exist. Activities like cross-dressing in our society, which is commonly done by heterosexual males, are stigmatized and perhaps even criminalized in our society because they do not fit into the expected norm of maleness. Now, I want to briefly discuss sexual orientation because they're related to an extent, but not one and the same, and so it's important to understand the distinction. Sexual orientation categorizes an individual's sexual attraction to and activities with others. There are 4 basic sexual orientations. Heterosexuality, which refers to the relationships between men and women. Homosexuality refers to relationships between people of the same sex, so male, male, female, female. Bisexuality refers to people who engage in sexual encounters with either men or women. And asexuality truly refers to people who have no sexual attraction at all. When we look at these categories, they're surprisingly hard to measure, because the question becomes, what constitutes sexual attraction or activity? How consistent must that attraction or activity be? Is it one sexual encounter? Is it some minimum number or frequency? How do we categorize someone whose sexual behavior changes over time? Plus the obvious problems with incomplete or inaccurate reporting. Heterosexuality is obviously necessary for reproduction. It's recognized in all societies, and it's generally, but not always, the most common sexual orientation. Homosexuality is recognized and not rare in almost 2/3 of the societies in one famous cross-cultural study. In a study of 76 societies by Ford and Beach in 1951, homosexuality was absent, rare, or secret in 37% of the 76 societies. It was a recognized aspect of almost 2/3 of the societies studied. That doesn't say how many people were homosexual in each culture or what the rules and values about it were, just that it was recognized as a relatively standard orientation in most cultures. It's present and known in most cultures. Not necessarily condoned, but a recognized category of persons and or behavior. Bisexuality is hotly debated. Some studies in the U.S. suggest that there may not be any people who are consistently attracted to both sexes, making bisexuality a behavior but not an orientation. This is hard to square with extensive examples of flexible sexual behaviors in other cultures, however. So there's currently no consensus for this frequency in the U.S. And asexuality, in one study in England, found that about 1% of the population is not attracted to either sex at all. But this is surprisingly hard to measure because people who are asexual still often try to go with the sexual norm, and oftentimes they will marry, they will have children, they will engage in sexual behavior even though they are not attracted to either sex at all or interested in it at all. These sexual categories and ideas about them are culturally constructed and at least somewhat arbitrary. In most variants of the current U.S. culture, a person's sexual orientation is thought to be permanent, inherent, something one is either born with or acquires early in life and really cannot change. So to many Americans, sexual orientation is a permanent, defining part of gender identity. In many other cultures, such as the Azande, the Atoro, the Classical Greek, a person will have one gender throughout their whole life, usually male or female, but their sexual orientation would change in culturally determined ways as the person grew up through different stages of their life. So in many cultures, sexual orientation is not fixed. It is a part of the definition of gender identity, but not typically the whole story. And it's important to note that gender categories such as male, female, or third genders are arbitrary cultural constructs. They vary from one culture to another, and they do not necessarily correspond to sexual orientation. So we are talking about three different things here that can be related but aren't necessarily always related. So let's talk about gender quickly. Gender categories are socially constructed, and I'm going to speak specifically about the United States, but when we see these in other cultures as well, they are also socially constructed there. They are actively created and taught in an observable process of constructing individuals' gender identities. So in our society, parents and others give children gender-appropriate names, clothes, toys, and other items. Parents use different linguistic styles with boys and girls. More diminutives are used with girls, such as doggy. More interstate words are used with girls, things like happy. More direct prohibitives are used with boys. No, boys don't cry, and the like. Parents and schools teach boys to be aggressive, competitive, and tough, and girls to be caring and helpful. So many times you'll see a boy acting out and they'll say, oh, boys will be boys, and justify it that way. And the point of really any of those examples, and if you stop and think about it, if you look at commercials, if you look at toys, if you look at clothing, if you look at our entire culture, gender identities are constructed, built, and created in a process you can clearly see happening. These gender roles are not just out there. They are created, and to some extent, intentionally. In many societies, including our own, there may be more than two genders recognized based on a combination of behaviors and biology. We can speak to our own, so you can do a little bit of additional research on our own. We know some of the more common additional genders in our society, and I want to talk about a couple of others that you might not recognize as well. So the Plains Indians and many other native groups conceived of the world as having three genders: men, who are biologically male and behaviorally masculine, women, who are biologically female and behaviorally feminine, and the Burdash, who are biologically male, behaviorally feminine, or occasionally biologically female and behaviorally masculine. A Burdash was considered to be a very good wife for a man because women's work was fairly strenuous and Burdash were physically stronger than women. A very fortunate man would have a female wife who would bear children and a Burdash wife who would contribute to the household work. The husband might or might not have sexual relations with a Burdash wife. Burdash also had the option of taking a wife of their own. These relationships were not considered to be homosexual since they were not considered the same gender. Among the California Indians, there were very many societies that had four genders: men who were biologically female and behaviorally masculine, women who were biologically female and behaviorally feminine, Burdash who were biologically male and behaviorally feminine, and two-spirit women who were biologically female and behaviorally masculine and feminine. These tribes believed that at birth, a baby had no spirit, and that in the first few hours of a baby's life, loose spirits in the world would find and inhabit the baby to create the whole person. Occasionally, they believed, two spirits, one male and one female, would take up residence within a baby girl, and that girl would become a two-spirit woman. Two-spirit women were allowed to achieve status as hunters, warriors, and as visionaries, healers, and shamans. They were considered especially good at mediating debates because they were believed to be fully capable of understanding both the female and male perspective simultaneously. They were also believed to be more effective as religious people because they were more acutely tuned to the spirit world. They were allowed to take either wives or husbands. So you can see that in other societies, this notion of this third gender doesn't have the same stigma that it seems to have in our society. So it's honestly sometimes a little bit confusing why this occurs in our society. And the book gives you a ton of other examples of societies that have more than two gender categories, and you also see some examples in the film, so be sure to watch that. From these discussions, I hope you'll recognize, though it seems odd to us, it is not unusual for society to have more than two gender categories, and that gender does not have to be tightly aligned with biological sex, and is not necessarily tightly aligned with sexuality.